He wasn't supposed to be there that night. A tired handyman, rain-soaked and unremarkable, sitting alone at a table meant for people with reservations and expense accounts. But when a powerful man grabbed a young woman's wrist and the entire room looked away, Mason Ryder didn't. He never could. Some men are built that way, not by choice, but by everything they've survived. What happened next would shake the foundations of one of America's most powerful families and cost a brutal man everything he'd spent a lifetime stealing. Like this video, drop your city in the comments and follow this story all the way to the end. The rain had been coming down since 4 in the afternoon, the kind of steady, indifferent rain that doesn't bother announcing itself. It just settles in and makes itself at home. By the time Mason Ryder pulled his truck into the parking lot off the waterfront, his jacket was already damp at the shoulders from the walk between job sites, and he smelled like caulk and sawdust and the particular exhaustion of a man who hadn't sat down since 6 in the morning. He almost didn't stop. That was the thing he'd think about later, how close he came to just driving straight home, heating up whatever was left in the refrigerator, and falling asleep on the couch before his daughter's bedtime story was finished. That had been the plan. That was almost always the plan. But Lily had a sleepover at her friend Cora's house tonight, the first one she'd been excited about in months, and Mason had dropped her off with her little purple backpack and her stuffed rabbit, and she'd run up the driveway without looking back. Which was good. That was what you wanted. A kid who ran toward things without looking back. He knew that. It still left him with an empty truck cab and no particular reason to rush home to an empty house. So he pulled into the lot beside Harborview, which was the kind of restaurant he didn't normally set foot in. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water, soft amber lighting, white tablecloths you could see from the parking lot. The valet out front glanced at Mason's truck, a 2009 Ford F-150, with a crack running along the lower corner of the windshield and a ladder rack that had seen better decades, and managed to keep his expression mostly neutral. Mason had cleaned up as best he could, changed his shirt in the truck cab, ran a hand through his hair, which was dark and getting a little long at the collar. He was 33, but looked, depending on the light and how tired he was, somewhere between 28 and 40. The kind of face that had been through things without turning hard about it. He was 6 feet even, built like someone who hadn't needed a gym since his body had simply decided what it wanted to be and stayed there. But there was nothing performed about it. He moved like a man who was used to carrying things. He'd driven past Harborview 100 times. Tonight, for no particular reason, he went in. The hostess looked uncertain for exactly 1 second before she pulled a menu and led him to a two-top near the back window. He asked for water and opened the menu and looked at the prices with the flat, unemotional gaze of a man doing math he didn't like. He ordered the least expensive entree, a pasta dish, and a coffee, and he settled back and looked out at the harbor. The rain made the lights on the water blur and streak. It was actually something, he thought, worth stopping for. He didn't pay much attention to the dining room for the first 20 minutes. He had his coffee. He watched the water. He thought about the bathroom tile job he had starting Monday in Millbrook, and whether he needed to order more cement board, and whether Lily was going to remember to take her allergy medication in the morning. These were the thoughts that filled most of the space in his head on any given evening, and they weren't bad thoughts. They were real thoughts. He had learned to find a kind of quiet in them. He noticed the man at the large corner table the way you notice a sound that's too loud for the room, not immediately, but suddenly, all at once. He was somewhere in his late 50s, silver-haired and broad across the chest in the way that money sometimes builds. The kind of physical confidence that comes not from fitness, but from decades of never being told no. He had a sport coat that probably cost more than Mason's truck payment, and a watch that caught the light in a way that seemed almost intentional. There were 3 other men at his table, associates, yes men, the gravitational orbit of a man who demanded company, and they were all leaning slightly toward him, which told Mason everything he needed to know about the dynamic. The waitress who came to take their drink orders was young, early 20s maybe, with dark hair pulled back and a posture that suggested she'd been trained to keep her spine straight and her expression pleasant regardless of circumstance. She had a small notebook, and she was holding it with both hands in a way Mason recognized as someone bracing themselves before stepping into something uncertain. He watched because he couldn't help it. He'd been trained to watch rooms. Even 5 years out of the Navy, even in the middle of a pasta dinner, the habit never fully left him. Who was looking at what? Who was sitting too still, where the exits were? Which voice was too loud? You didn't get to turn it off. You just learned to keep it quiet in the background. The silver-haired man, Mason would later learn his name was Dale Whitmore, ordered something, and when the young waitress confirmed it back to him, Whitmore interrupted her. Not to correct her, just to interrupt her, to let her know he could. Mason couldn't hear the words clearly, but he could hear the tone. And the tone was the same in any language. You're beneath me, and I want you to feel it. The waitress apologized. She had nothing to apologize for. Mason went back to his coffee. He tried to stay out of it. That was the other thing he'd think about later. How deliberately he tried to mind his own business. He was a handyman eating dinner alone. He was tired. He had a tile job on Monday. This wasn't his table and it wasn't his problem. And there were people in this room whose job it was to handle difficult customers, and none of them were him. He lasted about 4 minutes. It was the second time that did it. The waitress returned with the drinks, and she must have gotten something slightly wrong. Or maybe she got nothing wrong at all. Maybe it was just another opportunity. Because Whitmore's voice went up half a register, and people at nearby tables glanced over and then immediately looked back down at their food with the practiced disengagement of people who decided their salmon was very interesting. Mason watched the nearby tables, watched the maitre d' near the front, who was looking at a reservation book, watched the other server 2 stations over, who had gone still. No one was moving. The waitress was nodding, apologizing again, her notebook pressed to her chest now, and Mason could see from where he sat that her jaw was tight and she was keeping her eyes level with tremendous effort. Then Whitmore reached out and closed his hand around her wrist. Not to hurt her. Not exactly, maybe that would be Mason's more charitable interpretation later, but to stop her from leaving. To assert the simple fact that she would stay and continue receiving his irritation for as long as he decided she would. His fingers wrapped around her wrist, and he kept talking, louder now, something about incompetence, something about what he paid for a table at this establishment, and the 3 men with him watched their drinks. Mason set down his coffee cup. He did it quietly. He pushed back his chair, and he stood up, and he walked across the dining room, and he did it the way he'd once moved through hostile spaces. Not fast, not slow, just with the complete absence of hesitation that is its own kind of statement. He didn't bump any chairs, he didn't look at the other diners. He crossed the room and stopped at the edge of Whitmore's table, and he looked at the man's hand on the young woman's wrist. "Let go of her," he said. His voice was calm. Not threatening, not loud, just the particular flatness of a man who says a thing once and means it the same way every time. Whitmore looked up. The shift in his expression was almost interesting. Surprise first, then irritation, then something that was trying to become contempt but wasn't quite landing because Mason was standing in a certain way that made contempt a harder sell. "Excuse me?" Whitmore said. "I said, let go of her wrist." "Who the hell are you?" "Nobody," Mason said. "Let go of her wrist." There was a silence in the immediate vicinity that was spreading outward like a ripple. Mason was aware of it. He was also aware of the young woman's face, which had changed. Not with relief exactly, but with a complicated mix of surprise and something that looked like she wasn't sure yet whether this was going to make things worse. Whitmore's grip released. He didn't do it gracefully. He sort of threw her wrist down, a theatrical dismissal, as if releasing her was his idea and he was doing Mason a favor. "Mind your own business." "It became my business when you put your hand on her," Mason said. He looked at the young woman. "You okay?" She blinked. Yes, I'm okay." "You don't have to stay here," Mason said. He wasn't telling her what to do. He was just making sure she knew she had options. There was a difference. Whitmore stood up. He was a big man, and he clearly knew it, had probably used it to end arguments his whole life. He was accustomed to the way people adjusted when he unfolded himself to full height. Mason did not adjust. "Do you know who I am?" Whitmore said. "No," Mason said. "I own half the waterfront development on this coastline. I have people who handle—" "I don't care," Mason said. And the thing was, he really didn't. You could hear it. There was no bravado in it, no performance. It was just a factual statement, the same register he'd used to say it's going to rain tomorrow, or I need a quarter-inch drill bit. He genuinely, completely did not care. Whitmore stared at him. Behind him, his associates were performing various degrees of looking elsewhere. You need to go back to your table, Whitmore said, lower now, quieter, which sometimes means angrier. I'm going to, Mason said, as soon as you sit back down. The moment stretched. Mason had learned something in the Navy, confirmed across too many hours in too many situations to count. Most men, when confronted by someone who shows absolutely no fear and wants absolutely nothing, don't know what to do. They're used to wanting, to leverage, to the calculation of loss and gain. A man who can't be leveraged and isn't asking for anything back is a different problem entirely. Whitmore's anger had nowhere useful to go. He sat down. Mason looked at the young woman once more, a brief, direct look that said, "You're all right," without making it into something bigger than it needed to be. Then he turned and walked back to his table. He sat down. He picked up his coffee. Around him, the dining room exhaled. He didn't look up. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He picked up his fork and finished his pasta, which had gone slightly cold, and he thought about Lily at her sleepover and whether she'd remembered the rabbit, because she sometimes forgot the rabbit when she was too excited, and then she couldn't sleep without it. Across the dining room, he could see the young waitress in his peripheral vision. She'd moved to a service station near the kitchen pass-through, and she was standing with her back to the wall, taking slow, deliberate breaths, the kind you take when you're trying not to let anyone see how much your hands are shaking. What Mason didn't know, what he had no reason to know, sitting there in his damp jacket in a restaurant he'd never been to before, eating pasta he'd ordered because it was the cheapest thing on the menu, was that the young woman's name was not, as her name tag read, Vicky. Her name was Victoria Ashford. And her father had not built half the waterfront. He'd built rather more than that. He didn't know any of it. He finished his dinner, left a tip that was too large for what he'd ordered because he'd grown up watching his mother leave large tips and had never stopped. And he nodded once to the young woman as he passed the service station on his way out. She said, "Wait." He paused. She stopped, started again. "Thank you. Nobody else—" She looked at the floor for a second. Nobody else did anything. "I noticed," Mason said. He said it without judgment, though it was also entirely factual. "Are you—" She looked at him, and there was something searching in it, like she was trying to figure out a thing she didn't have the right question for yet. "Are you okay? Did he say anything to you after?" "Nothing that required a response," Mason said. She almost laughed. It came out small, surprised. "My name's—" She hesitated, and something crossed her face that he couldn't read. "I'm Vicky." "Mason," he said. He didn't offer a hand. She was still holding her notebook and her tray, and she had 3 tables waiting. Just his name. "Take care of yourself." He pushed through the front door and back into the rain. His truck was where he'd left it. He climbed in and sat for a second, the rain loud on the roof, the harbor lights fracturing in the wet windshield. His hands rested loose on the wheel. His shoulder was tight. Old injury, always got worse in the cold, and he rolled it once, twice, and then started the engine. He wasn't thinking about what he'd done. He wasn't replaying it or analyzing it or waiting for whatever feeling was supposed to come afterward. He'd seen something wrong, and he'd stopped it, and now it was over, and he had a long drive home. He thought about calling Lily's sleepover to check in. He decided against it. She'd be fine. She was always fine. She was braver than him, honestly, in all the ways that mattered. He pulled out of the lot and into the rain. In the warm amber light of Harborview behind him, Victoria Ashford stood at the service station with her notebook pressed to her sternum, watching the old Ford truck disappear into the dark. Her phone was buzzing in her apron pocket. It had been buzzing for the last 4 minutes. She already knew who it was. Her father's head of security ran a tight operation, and she'd spotted at least one of his people near the bar the moment she'd come on shift, which meant her father had known where she was for probably longer than she'd hoped. The whole arrangement, the undercover waitress experiment, the attempt to understand what ordinary work actually felt like, had probably had a shorter runway than she'd negotiated for. She didn't reach for the phone yet. She was still thinking about the man who'd walked across the room like he had all the time in the world, looked a man with half a coastline's worth of leverage in the face, and said, "I don't care," and meant it. She'd met thousands of powerful men. She'd negotiated with them, outmaneuvered them, inherited a company that would one day surpass most of them. She thought she had a reasonable sense of what strength looked like in practice. She was revising that understanding. The phone buzzed again. She reached into her apron pocket and silenced it. She'd call her father back. She'd explain. She'd deal with whatever came next in its appropriate order. But for right now, just for another minute or two, she stood in the warm light while the rain came down outside, and she thought about a man who'd asked for nothing and what exactly that was supposed to mean. The security report landed in Edward Ashford's inbox at 9:47 that evening, flagged urgent by his head of detail, a former federal marshal named Greer, who had worked for the Ashford family for 11 years and who did not use the word urgent casually. Edward was in his study when it came through, 61 years old, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a glass of scotch he'd been nursing since 8 sitting mostly untouched on the side table. The study was the one room in the house that looked genuinely lived in. The rest of the estate had a curated quality, the kind of interior that appeared in architectural magazines and felt, upon close inspection, like a stage set. But the study had books with broken spines, and a desk covered in actual paper, and 2 chairs that had been reupholstered 3 times because he refused to replace them. He read Greer's report standing up. Then he sat down, read it again, and set his phone on the desk. His daughter had been working as a waitress at Harborview for 11 days. She'd negotiated this with him back in March. Not asked, negotiated, which was how Victoria had approached most things since she was approximately 14 years old. She wanted to understand the hospitality industry from the floor up before the Ashford Group finalized its acquisition of a boutique hotel brand. She wanted real data, not a consultant summary. She was going to do it properly or not at all. He'd agreed, with conditions. Greer's team would have eyes on her at all times. She would carry an emergency contact. She would check in twice daily. What he had not anticipated, or perhaps had not let himself think too carefully about, was that someone would put their hands on her. He read the report a 3rd time. The part about the man, Mason Ryder, he read 4 times. Greer had attached a preliminary file, assembled quickly from public records and what the team could pull on short notice. Edward went through it slowly. 33 years old, former U.S. Navy SEAL, 8 years of service, honorably discharged. Wife deceased, cancer, 3 years into their marriage, when their daughter was 18 months old. Now raising the girl alone, a 5-year-old named Lily, in a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of Carver's Point. Self-employed as a handyman and general contractor for the past 4 years. Drove a 2009 Ford truck. Had no criminal record, no civil judgments, no debt and collections. His business reviews online were the kind that didn't sound like marketing. Mason showed up when he said he would. Fixed the problem. Charged a fair price. One review from an elderly woman in his neighborhood said he'd repaired her back porch steps 3 times in 2 years and refused payment twice because, she wrote, he said he could see from the street that they weren't right yet. Edward closed the file and looked at the window. In 40 years of building one of the largest private real estate and development firms in the country, he had hired a great many people. He had a reasonable sense of how to read a person on paper. What the file on Mason Ryder told him wasn't what the man had. It was what he'd never tried to acquire. No LinkedIn profile, no networking events, no attempt to position himself, market himself, leverage his military service into something more lucrative. He'd come home from the Navy, lost his wife within a year, and rebuilt his life around what was apparently a workshop and a 5-year-old girl, and he seemed to have decided that was enough. Edward poured a small amount of scotch into his glass, which he had not done in a while, and drank it thoughtfully. He picked up his phone and called Victoria. She answered on the 2nd ring, which meant she'd been waiting for it. "I'm fine," she said before he could speak. "I know you're fine. Greer sent photos." A pause. "How many people did you have in there?" "2, possibly 3, depending on how you count the one at the bar." "Dad, you were assaulted." He grabbed my wrist. I was handling it. Edward kept his voice level. "Greer's report suggests you were not in fact handling it, and that a man named Mason Ryder handled it on your behalf." Another pause, longer this time. She started, stopped. He could hear her choosing words, which she didn't often do. Victoria was precise and fast with language, had been since she was small. When she slowed down, it meant something. He walked over like it was nothing, like he'd just decided and that was it. No. No build-up. No look around to see who was watching. No making sure people noticed him doing a good thing. He just did it. And then he walked back to his dinner. And then he walked back to his dinner, she confirmed. Her voice had something in it he couldn't name exactly. He didn't even want to talk about it. I thanked him and he said, she paused again. He said, it became my business when you put your hand on her. Like it was just a fact. Like the logic was so obvious he didn't understand why it needed explaining. Edward was quiet for a moment. Get some rest, he said. I'd like to talk tomorrow. About what exactly? About what's next. Dad, I'm not pulling you out, he said. I just want to talk. There's a difference. She made a sound that meant she wasn't fully convinced of the difference, but was too tired to argue it tonight. They said goodnight, and he set down the phone, and he sat for a long time in the study with the untouched glass and the file on his desk. Outside, the rain had stopped. Mason was up at 5:30 the following morning because he was always up at 5:30, a habit the Navy had installed with such thoroughness that he'd never managed to shake it even when he actively tried. He ran 3 miles in the gray early dark, the streets wet and empty, and when he got back he made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at his small backyard where Lily's bicycle was parked against the fence, slightly crooked because she always parked it at an angle and couldn't be convinced otherwise. He had 45 minutes before he needed to pick her up from Cora's house. He drank his coffee and he thought, not for the first time, about the previous evening. He'd thought about it briefly before bed and told himself it was done, which was usually effective. But there was something about the look on that woman's face when she'd stopped him at the service station, nobody else did anything, that hadn't fully settled. It wasn't the look of someone surprised that strangers weren't helpful. It was something more specific than that. Like she'd expected less from the world in general, and he'd temporarily disrupted that expectation, and she didn't quite know where to put it. He knew that look. He'd seen it in Carver's Point, on the faces of people who'd stopped counting on things to work out. It was a particular kind of tiredness. He rinsed his mug, changed his shirt, and drove to pick up Lily. She came out of Cora's front door at 6:47 with the purple backpack and the stuffed rabbit she'd remembered, and a drawing she'd made that she held out to him before she even said good morning. "It's you fixing Mrs. Patterson's fence," she said. He looked at it. There was a stick figure with a hammer and another smaller stick figure, presumably Lily herself, standing to the side. The fence was drawn as a series of vertical lines that went slightly uphill in a way that suggested Mrs. Patterson's property was located on a substantial incline. "This is excellent," Mason said. "I know," Lily said, and climbed into the truck. She talked for most of the drive home. She was 5 and she talked like someone who had been storing up observations all night and needed to release them efficiently. Cora's mom made pancakes in the shape of animals. Cora had a cat that didn't like being held but sat on Lily's feet, which was different. Cora said her older brother was annoying, but Lily thought he seemed okay, just shy. She'd had a bad dream partway through the night, but it wasn't a really bad one, just confusing. Mason listened. He asked the right questions. He was a man who was generally more comfortable listening than talking, and with Lily, he'd learned that this was not a limitation, but an advantage. She needed someone to really receive what she was saying, not just wait for their turn, and he was good at that. He'd always been good at that. They stopped for groceries on the way home. Lily held the list, which was her job, and crossed things off with a stub of pencil she kept in the small front pocket of her backpack. She was very serious about the list. "You forgot oatmeal," she said, in the cereal aisle. "I didn't forget. I was going to skip it." "You can't skip oatmeal." "Why not?" She looked at him with the weary patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone they'd decided to love anyway. "Because it's on the list." He got the oatmeal. Dale Whitmore arrived at his office that morning with the particular energy of a man who had spent the night deciding someone else was responsible for his humiliation. He had people for this kind of thing. An attorney who had made problems disappear before. a publicist who was skilled at shaping narratives. He made calls. What he could not immediately locate in his first 2 hours of making calls was the name of the man who'd stepped in at Harborview. The restaurant's general manager was unhelpful. The waitress in question, Whitmore's assistant, had already tried, was not responding to calls, and HR had confirmed carefully that they could not release personal information about staff. Nobody at his table had caught a name. One of his associates said the man had simply been introduced as nobody, which Whitmore found both insulting and somehow irritatingly plausible. He dictated a letter of complaint to Harborview's ownership group. He made a call to someone he knew at the city planning office. He ordered lunch at his desk and ate it while staring at his phone. He was not a man who sat comfortably with feeling small. He never had been. What made him good at what he did? The waterfront development, the leverage, the deals that relied on people being more afraid of him than he was of them, was the same thing that made moments like last night's feel physically intolerable. Someone had stood in front of a room full of people who mattered and treated Dale Whitmore like a problem to be managed. He was going to find out who that someone was. He did not yet understand that this intention was one of several catastrophically miscalculated decisions he was making in a very short window of time. Bomb. Edward Ashford arrived at Harborview the following evening at 7. He'd called ahead, not to make a reservation. The establishment kept a standing arrangement for the Ashford family, but to confirm that Dale Whitmore had, in fact, made a reservation for what his assistant had described as a regular Wednesday dinner with associates. He had. Edward arrived alone, which was unusual enough that the maitre d' looked briefly uncertain about where to seat him. Edward requested a table with a clear sight line to the room, which was interpreted as a preference and accommodated. He was not there primarily for Whitmore. He was there because Greer had confirmed that Victoria was working the floor again tonight. She'd insisted, called it unfinished business, which was such a Victoria thing to say that he hadn't argued, and because he wanted to see for himself. Not her. The room. How she moved in it. What it was telling her. He watched her work for almost 40 minutes before Whitmore arrived with his table of 3. She was good at it, he noticed. Kept her face neutral in the way of someone who'd learned to. She was attentive without being ingratiating, quick without appearing rushed. He'd watched her negotiate with 6 different heads of industry over the past 3 years, and she had the same quality in both contexts. She was always reading the room about 3 moves ahead of the room's awareness that it was being read. She spotted him at minute 41. He saw the small flicker of recognition, then the deliberate non-reaction. She did not change pace or direction. She finished the order she was taking, walked it to the kitchen pass, and then, on her way back, stopped 3 feet from his table. "You're not subtle," she said quietly. "I ordered the salmon," he said. "I'm paying the same as everyone else." "That's not what subtle means." "I wanted to see you work." She looked at him for a moment. "And?" "And you're wasted in here," he said. "But I think you already knew that. And the point was never efficiency." He tilted his head slightly. "How's your wrist?" Something moved across her face. Not pain. She'd have told him if there was real pain, something more complicated than that. "It's fine." "Good." She glanced toward the entrance. "He's not here yet." "He will be," Edward said. She studied him. "What are you planning?" "Nothing dramatic," he said, which was partially true. She looked at him a moment longer, the particular look she'd given him since she was a teenager, the one that meant, "I don't entirely believe you, but I'm going to need more information before I decide how concerned to be." Then she moved back onto the floor. Whitmore arrived at 7:40 with the same 3 men from the previous evening and the same settled authority of a man who expected rooms to arrange themselves around him. He was in a better suit than last night. Compensation, Edward thought, the way insecure people dress up after they've felt diminished. He settled into his corner table and ordered before anyone had time to offer him a menu. Edward waited. He was a patient man when patience was the correct tool. He'd built his company on the understanding that most situations resolve themselves more favorably if you gave them the right amount of time and the right amount of silence. He finished his salmon, which was actually quite good. and drank his water and watched Dale Whitmore across the dining room with the mild, attentive expression of someone reading something moderately interesting. Whitmore noticed him at the 30-minute mark. The recognition was visible from across the room. The small realignment, the sudden attention, the rapid recalculation that Edward could almost see happening in real time. He watched Whitmore say something quiet to the associate on his right, who then looked over, looked away, and nodded. Edward raised his water glass slightly, a minimal acknowledgement, and watched Whitmore's jaw tighten. He stood and walked over to Whitmore's table, which he'd planned to do, and he did it unhurried, the way a man moves through a space he owns. "Dale," he said. "Edward." Whitmore's voice was careful. "I didn't know you came here." "I come occasionally." Edward looked at the table, at the three men who were now very interested in their bread. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course." The word "of course" was doing enormous work. Edward sat in the empty chair at the end of the table, which Whitmore hadn't exactly offered. "I understand you had some trouble here last night." Whitmore's expression shifted through 3 different calculations before landing on a version of affronted dignity. "I had a difference of opinion with a member of staff, yes. I've been in contact with management. The young woman whose wrist you grabbed," Edward said, "is my daughter." The table went still. Whitmore opened his mouth, closed it. "Her name is Victoria," Edward continued, his voice exactly where it had been. "And she was working here as a research exercise before she steps into the CEO role at Ashford Group. She was not injured, which is fortunate for everyone." The dining room was not quiet, but the table was quiet, the specific quiet of men who are trying to disappear into their chairs. Whitmore's face had traveled through several stops and arrived at something pale and effortful. "Edward, I had no idea." "No, you didn't," Edward agreed. "That's rather the point. You treated her the way you treat people you believe have no power over you." He kept his tone conversational, which was more effective than anger, had always been more effective than anger. The Carvers Point Waterfront Project, the Millbrook Development, the 3 municipal contracts you have currently pending before the Planning Commission. He let those sit for a moment. "I've been watching your work for a while, Dale. The methodology concerns me." Whitmore was gripping his water glass. "The Planning Commission isn't—" "I know it isn't," Edward said. "Lots of things are in stages right now. Stages can be complicated." He stood. "The young woman you touched is fine. I'd suggest taking the evening to reflect on the difference between having power and knowing what to do with it." He returned to his table, finished his water, and requested the check. Victoria was at the service station. She'd been watching. He could tell from the angle of her shoulders. She caught his eye across the room and held it for a moment, and in that moment he saw the full complexity of what his daughter actually was. She was not grateful that he'd handled it, was possibly annoyed that he had, but underneath both of those things was something that looked like the particular guarded relief of someone who'd spent years insisting they didn't need help and had just been reminded that needing help and receiving it are not the same as being weak. He left the tip on the table and put on his coat. He had one more thing to do tonight. Well, Mason had been in the workshop behind his rental house for 2 hours when he heard the knock. The workshop was technically a detached garage that a previous tenant had started converting into something else and given up on partway through, leaving exposed studs on one wall and a concrete floor that had never been finished. Mason had spent the better part of a year making it functional. A proper workbench, a French cleat wall for tools, overhead lighting that didn't flicker. It wasn't much, but it was organized, which mattered to him in the specific way that an organized workspace matters to someone whose interior life doesn't always feel organized. He was building a bookcase. Not for a client. For Lily, who had run out of shelf space at some point in the fall and had begun stacking books in arrangements on the floor that she insisted were sorting systems and not mess. The knock came from the side door, which opened to the narrow strip of driveway. He set down the chisel and went to the door and opened it. The man standing outside was around 60, lean, in a coat that was understated in the way of expensive things that don't need to announce themselves. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into something rather than away from something, like decades had added to it rather than subtracted. He stood without any of the physical uncertainty people sometimes have when they're somewhere unfamiliar. He looked like he'd simply decided to stand there, and here he was. "Mason Ryder?" the man said. "Yeah. My name is Edward Ashford." A pause. "I believe you met my daughter last night." Mason looked at him. He didn't say anything for a moment, going back over the previous evening, finding the relevant pieces. The young waitress. Vicky. The way she'd hesitated before giving her name. "Come in," Mason said, and stepped back from the door. Edward entered the workshop and looked around it with the genuine attention of someone who actually sees spaces rather than just occupying them. He looked at the workbench, the tool wall, the half-assembled bookcase on the floor. "Who's that for?" he asked. "My daughter," Mason said. "She's 5. She has a lot of books." Edward nodded at that, something thoughtful in it. "Victoria told me what happened. I wanted to thank you in person." "You didn't have to do that." "No," Edward agreed, "but I wanted to." He looked at Mason directly. "She said you crossed the room, told the man to let go of her, and then went back to your dinner. More or less." "Why?" Mason considered the question, which most people wouldn't have asked. He had his hand on her wrist, and nobody was doing anything about it. "And that was enough for you?" "Yeah." Edward was quiet for a moment. He wasn't performing thoughtfulness. He was actually thinking. Mason had been around enough men in enough situations to know the difference. "I'm going to be straightforward with you," Edward said. "I've read your background, not intrusively. Basic records, your service history, reviews from people you've worked for." He paused. "I'm not in the habit of investigating private citizens, but the circumstances seemed to warrant understanding who my daughter had encountered." Mason didn't say anything to that. He wasn't offended exactly. It was what a man in that position would do. "What I found was a man with an interesting gap between what he's capable of and what he's chosen to do with it," Edward said. "That's one way to put it," Mason said. "What's your way?" Mason looked at the half-built bookcase on the floor. "I came home. My wife was sick. Then she wasn't sick anymore, she was just gone, and I had a daughter who needed things to be stable, so I made things stable." He said it without drama, which somehow made it heavier. "I'm good with my hands. I'm good at showing up when I say I will, and I sleep fine at night. That's most of what I wanted." Edward was quiet for a moment longer than most people were comfortable being quiet. "I'd like to offer you something," he said. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I'd like to." Mason waited. Edward named it plainly, without build-up. A position within the Ashford organization, operations and project management, the kind of role that would put his skills and instincts to work at a scale that matched them. A salary that was a significant number. A housing stipend. A vehicle through the company account. A college fund established in Lily's name, which he left for last because he was a man who understood sequencing. Mason listened to all of it without interrupting. He had good manners that way. He let people finish. When Edward was done, Mason said, "No." Edward raised an eyebrow, not with offense, but with what appeared to be genuine interest. "All of it?" "All of it. Thank you, though. I mean that." "Can I ask why?" Mason thought about it. "She was in trouble and I helped her. That's just what you do. I don't need a return on it." He looked at Edward. "And I've got a job. 2 jobs on Monday." "Tile," Edward said. Mason looked at him. "The Millbrook project," Edward said with a faint and particular expression. "You're doing the tile work." "Yeah." A silence settled between them that was oddly not uncomfortable. Edward looked at the bookcase again. He looked at the tool wall. He looked at Mason in the way that people sometimes look at things they're trying to understand the value of, not in terms of price, but in terms of what they actually are. "My daughter," he said finally, "doesn't let people in easily." "That's not my business," Mason said. "No," Edward said. "It isn't." He looked at him a moment more. "Thank you, Mr. Ryder, for what you did." "Mason," he said. "Mason." Edward extended his hand. Mason shook it. The grip was firm on both sides, brief, neither of them making a production of it. He walked Edward back to the side door and watched him cross the driveway to a dark car that had been sitting, engine off, lights off, at the curb. A detail. Of course. Mason watched the car pull smoothly away and disappear around the corner, and then he stood in the doorway for a moment with his hands in his pockets. The night was clear, which was a change. No rain. The air smelled like wet asphalt and something faintly like cut wood from the workshop behind him. He went back inside, picked up the chisel, and looked at the bookcase. Lily had very specific opinions about where each shelf should go. He'd asked her to draw him a diagram, which she had, in crayon, with labels. The labels were not all spelled correctly, but the measurements she'd indicated with a ruler and her best interpretation of the markings were surprisingly close to accurate, which was either impressive or concerning, depending on how you thought about it. He got back to work. He was not thinking about Edward Ashford or the money or the offer or any of it. He was thinking about the shelf spacing and about whether to use pocket screws or dado joints on the internal dividers, and about the look on Lily's face when she saw it finished, which he had a clear picture of already. The way her eyes would go wide first and then narrow slightly as she assessed it, making sure it met the specifications of the crayon diagram. He was thinking about that and nothing else, and it was enough. Across town, in a waterfront office on the 14th floor, Edward Ashford sat behind his desk and looked at the preliminary file on Mason Ryder that he had already read 4 times. He opened it again. He was not looking for new information. He was looking at what was already there, arranging it in his mind the way you arrange something you're not entirely sure what to do with yet. He had offered the man everything he thought a reasonable person would want, and Mason Ryder had said no with the same uncomplicated flatness with which he'd reportedly told Dale Whitmore he didn't care who he was. Edward had built a career on understanding what people wanted. He was 61, and he was very good at it, and he found himself sitting with the strange, not unpleasant sensation of having encountered someone he couldn't immediately read in that particular way. He closed the file. He was going to need to think about this. The tile job in Millbrook took 3 days. Mason worked alone, which was how he preferred it when the job required precision. And tile always required precision, or it required ripping everything out and starting over, which he'd done twice in his career and had no interest in doing again. The bathroom was a gut renovation in a 19th century house with floors that weren't level and walls that weren't plumb, which meant every measurement had to be checked and adjusted and checked again. And the work was slow in the way that careful work is always slow. He didn't mind. He had a thermos of coffee and a radio tuned to a station that played older country without apology, and he had the particular satisfaction of a problem that could be solved by paying close enough attention to it. On the second day, his phone buzzed around 2 in the afternoon, unknown number, local area code. He almost didn't answer. He was mid-cut. He finished the cut, set down the wet saw, and called back. "Mason?" A woman's voice, familiar in a way he needed a second to place. "It's Victoria, Ashford." He straightened up and looked at the wall in front of him. "Hey, I hope this is... My father gave me your number. I should have asked first." "It's fine," he said. A brief pause. "How's the tile?" He looked at the wall. "Slow." "My father said you were working in Millbrook. Your father knows a lot of things." "He does," she said, and there was something wry in it that was also a little tired. "He told me he came to see you, and that you turned down everything he offered." "I did." Another pause, this one different from the first, less uncertain, more like she was deciding something. "I'm not calling about that. I wanted to say thank you myself. In person would be better, but I didn't want to show up at a job site without asking." "You can show up at a job site," Mason said. "Really?" "I'm on Clement Street, the old Pharaoh house, if anyone still calls it that. I'll be here until 5. He went back to the tile. At 3:40, she knocked on the open front door and he called her through, and she found him in the upstairs bathroom, on his knees with a rubber mallet and a level. She was dressed differently than she'd been at the restaurant. Jeans, a plain navy jacket, hair down. She looked younger. She also looked like someone who'd spent the morning in a meeting and had driven here directly and hadn't thought much about the transition. She stood in the doorway of the bathroom and looked at the work. That's very straight, she said. It's supposed to be. I've had contractors do tile work that wasn't this straight. Then you hired the wrong people, he said, not unkindly. She leaned against the doorframe with her arms loosely crossed and watched him work for a moment. Most people who watched him work got uncomfortable with the silence after about 90 seconds and felt the need to fill it. She didn't. That was something. I'm sorry about my father showing up at your house, she said. He didn't need to apologize. You don't either. I know, but he does things sometimes without. He has a way of deciding what he thinks is right and doing it before consulting anyone else. Mason set the level on the tile, checked it, tapped the corner twice. Sound like anyone you know? She was quiet for a beat. That's fair. He sat back on his heels and looked at her. Are you actually okay? From the other night? Yes. She said it the way people say it when it's true, but they haven't given themselves much time to sit with it. My wrist is fine. I was more surprised than anything. He'd been difficult all week. I kept thinking the floor manager would intervene, but nobody did. Nobody did. She paused. Until you. He went back to the tile. You were handling yourself. I just moved things along. You really believe that? Yeah. Most men in that situation, if they did anything at all, and most didn't, they'd want something back for it. She wasn't being cynical exactly. She was being precise. A story to tell, or a look, or a name and number, something to show for it. I got my dinner, Mason said. She laughed, which was apparently not what she'd expected to do, because it surprised her slightly. It was a real laugh, short, unguarded, the kind that slips out before the person decides whether to allow it. My father offered you quite a lot, she said when she'd recovered. He did. And you said no. I said no. Why? He glanced up at her. Your father asked me the same question. And what did you tell him? That I've got work and I sleep fine. He looked back at the wall. What else is there, really? She was quiet for a moment. For most people, quite a lot. I'm not most people. She studied him with the same look she'd had at the restaurant, the one that meant she was filing information, organizing it, running it against something. No, she said after a moment. You're not. She stayed for another 20 minutes, which he hadn't expected. She didn't talk the whole time. She sat on an overturned bucket near the door and answered a few emails on her phone, and occasionally looked up at the tile work with the expression of someone who genuinely found process interesting. When she left, she shook his hand, which was a formal thing to do, and also somehow right, and said she'd like to buy him coffee sometime if he was willing, and he said sure, and that was that. He didn't know what to make of her. He filed it away without a label and went back to work. What happened to Dale Whitmore over the following 2 weeks did not happen all at once. It happened the way structural failures happen, quietly at first, in places nobody was watching, and then very fast. It started with the Planning Commission. The 3 municipal contracts Whitmore had pending went into an extended review period, which was technically within standard procedure and produced initially nothing more alarming than a slowdown. His attorney advised patience. His financial officer noted that the slowdown affected projected cash flow for Q2, but was manageable if the Harborside residential build moved on schedule. The Harborside build did not move on schedule. The general contractor pulled out. The reason given was a contract dispute over materials costs, which was real enough on paper, but Whitmore's project manager told him privately that the GC, who had worked for Whitmore on 4 previous projects, had simply declined to renegotiate terms he had accepted without complaint twice before. He had given no additional explanation. Then a piece ran in a regional business publication, not a hit piece, not an editorial, a reported feature on labor practices in coastal development projects, sourced from public records and interviews with former subcontractors. Whitmore's name appeared 11 times. The tone was even, which was worse than if it had been angry, because even-toned reporting had the quality of documentation rather than opinion. It quoted 3 former site managers, all of whom had requested anonymity. It described patterns, delayed payments to small contractors, pressure applied to building inspectors, a settlement sealed with a former project coordinator whose attorney had described the case in terms that the article was careful not to speculate about. The article did not mention Harborview. It did not mention Victoria Ashford or Edward or Mason Ryder. It mentioned nothing that hadn't existed in public records for years. It simply, for the first time, assembled those things into a single place and let them sit next to each other. Whitmore called his publicist. His publicist told him, with professional neutrality, that the best response was no response, and that engaging with it would extend its life. He followed this advice for approximately 4 days before calling a reporter he knew at a competing publication and making comments that were off the record and ill-advised, and that the reporter, to Whitmore's subsequent fury, published anyway. He called his attorney again. His attorney told him, with slightly less professional neutrality than usual, that the situation was evolving. Mason found out about the article the same way he found out about most things he didn't go looking for. Someone mentioned it to him. In this case, it was the homeowner in Millbrook, a retired teacher named Gerald, who followed local business news with the attentiveness of someone who'd lived in the same town for 40 years and took a particular interest in what happened to the coastline. "You see this piece about Whitmore?" Gerald asked on the third day, handing Mason his tablet with the article pulled up. Mason read it while his coffee cooled. He read carefully, which was how he read everything. He said, and handed the tablet back. "Know who that is?" Gerald asked. "I've heard the name." Gerald said something about waterfront development and the way money moved in small coastal towns, and Mason listened and nodded in the appropriate places and went back to the grout. He did not mention Harborview. He did not mention Victoria or Edward or any of it. It wasn't his story to tell. And besides, Gerald had a lot of opinions about waterfront development, and Mason had a half-day's work left. That evening, he got a text from an unknown number that turned out to be Victoria. "Did you see the article about Whitmore?" He typed back, "Gerald in Millbrook showed me." A pause, then, "Did you know this would happen?" He thought about how to answer that. "No. Did you?" Another pause, longer. "My father doesn't tell me everything he does. I've been trying to decide how I feel about that." He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he said, "Sounds like a reasonable thing to be working out." She sent back something that was either a laugh emoji or an eye roll, or possibly both, and then nothing else for the evening. The call came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the night at Harborview. Mason was in the workshop, finishing the bookcase. He'd been working on it in pieces between jobs. The carcass was done, the shelves were in, and he was fitting the face frame, which was the part Lily would see first, and which needed to be right. He had the radio on low. It was Edward. "I'd like you to come to something," Edward said without significant preamble. "A dinner. 2 Saturdays from now. Formal. Black tie, which I apologize for in advance. It's an annual thing, a gathering of board members and company leadership. We're using it this year to make some announcements." Mason set down the router. "What kind of announcements?" "Victoria is stepping into the CEO role officially. We're making it public that evening." A pause. "I'd like you to be there." "Why?" "Because you're part of this story, whether you intended to be or not. And because I think Victoria would like you there, though she would probably not say so directly." "Have you asked her?" "Not yet." "You should probably ask her." "I will, but I'm asking you first." Mason looked at the bookcase. The face frame was sitting slightly out of square on the left side, which meant he needed to re-clamp the left corner before the glue set. He picked up the clamp and adjusted it while he thought. "I don't own a tuxedo," he said. "That's a solvable problem," Edward said. "I'd have to arrange someone to stay with Lily." "Also solvable." "I'm not much for these kinds of events." "I know," Edward said. "Come anyway." Mason stood there for a moment with the clamp in his hand and the radio playing something he didn't know, and the bookcase sitting square now on the left side, which was what he'd needed. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Edward said, and hung up. Victoria called 20 minutes later. "He called you first, didn't he?" she said. "Yeah." A breath that might have been a laugh. "Of course he did." A pause. "You don't have to come." "I know. He means well. He just decides what he thinks is right and does it before consulting anyone else," Mason said. She was quiet for a second. I walked into that. A little bit. I'm going to be honest with you, she said, and her voice shifted into something that was quieter than her normal register, less managed. I'd like you to come. Not because my father thinks it would mean something, or because it's not about what you did at the restaurant anymore. That's not why. Okay, he said. I've been thinking about the tile job, she said. That was not what he'd expected her to say. What about it? You were on your knees on a cold bathroom floor checking a level for the 4th time on a measurement that was already good. And you did it anyway because you said you do the job right or you don't do the job. She paused. I've been running teams for 6 years. I've had people managing hundreds of millions in assets who couldn't tell me with a straight face why their number was their number. And you, she stopped. I don't know what I'm saying exactly. I think you do, he said. Another pause, different from the others. Will you come? He looked at the bookcase. Yeah, he said. I'll come. The 2 weeks between that conversation and the gala were, in their way, unremarkable for Mason. He finished 2 jobs, started a 3rd, picked Lily up from kindergarten 4 days a week, made dinner, helped with the drawings that Lily called homework, but which were primarily drawings, read stories, fixed the latch on Mrs. Patterson's gate on a Saturday morning because he'd noticed it was loose and it had been bothering him. Lily asked once why he was dressing nicely for dinner. I'm going to a party, he said. What kind of party? The kind with a lot of people I don't know. She considered this with the gravity she brought to most questions. Do you like that kind? Not especially. Then why are you going? He thought about it. He thought about Victoria on the overturned bucket, watching him check the level. He thought about the way she'd laughed, surprised by herself. He thought about what she'd said. I'd like you to come. Not because of what you did. That's not why. Because someone asked me to, he said, and I think it matters to them. Lily seemed to find this satisfactory. Okay, she said, and went back to her drawing. Tamag. The venue was a converted maritime museum on the harbor, the kind of building that had been built to last a century and was now on its 2nd. The event was exactly what Edward had described. Board members, company leadership, significant donors, the gravitational pull of people who moved money and called it something else. There were perhaps 200 people in the main hall and another 50 in the adjacent rooms, and every person Mason could see was in black tie or evening wear, and the room had the particular quality of a space where everything was expensive and nothing was for sale. He arrived in a rented tuxedo that fit well enough and felt like a costume, which he'd expected. He was not uncomfortable exactly. The Navy had put him in full dress whites for ceremonies that were considerably higher stakes than this, and he'd learned that a suit was just a suit. But he was aware of belonging to a different category than most of the people in the room. Greer found him near the entrance and walked him through the room's geography without making it feel like an escort, which Mason appreciated. Edward was at the far end with a cluster of board members. Victoria was not yet visible. He got a glass of water from a passing tray and stood near the window facing the harbor, which was lit up in silver in the cold night air. He watched the room the way he always watched rooms, but without any particular purpose this time. Nobody in here was a threat to anyone. They were just people who knew how to work a room, which was its own skill set, and he respected skill sets even when they weren't his. You look like you're guarding the window, said a voice beside him. He turned. Victoria was standing 2 feet away in a deep green dress and her hair up, and she looked. He didn't have an immediate word for it. Not like the waitress and not like a CEO. Like herself, he thought, which was possibly the first time he'd seen that clearly. I probably am, he said. Is the window in danger? Seems fine so far. She stood beside him and looked out at the harbor. Thank you for coming. You already said that, on the phone. I know, I meant it more now. He looked at her profile, the way she was watching the water. You nervous? He asked. She was quiet for a beat. About the announcement? No. A pause. About all these people watching me become something I've been for a while already? A little. Why? Because making something official means you can be held to it. Officially. She glanced at him. which I know sounds backwards. It doesn't, he said. It sounds honest. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the look that was different from the restaurant and different from the tile job, more direct, like she'd run out of patience for the indirect approach. Then she turned back to the room, and her posture shifted slightly. The composure settling back into place, not performed, just present. "My father's about to start," she said. Across the room, Edward was moving toward the low platform at the front. The remarks were not long. Edward was not a man who used 10 minutes when 5 would do, which was something his company's board of directors appreciated for slightly different reasons than his daughter did. He spoke about the company, its founding, which was 32 years ago in a rented office with 2 employees and a second mortgage. Its growth, which had not been smooth. He mentioned specifically 3 years in the mid-90s when the company had been close enough to failure that he'd sold his car. He spoke about what he'd tried to build, which was not just a financial institution, but a way of operating, a standard, and about how standards were only as good as the people who held to them when it was inconvenient. Then he looked across the room to where Mason was standing. 3 weeks ago, Edward said, something happened that I want to tell you about. The room gave him its attention, which rooms full of important people do when Edward Ashford wants them to. He told the story plainly. No embellishment. A man at a restaurant, a young woman in trouble, everyone else looking away. A former Navy SEAL and single father who crossed the room because he saw something wrong, and that was simply what you did when you saw something wrong. I offered this man a great deal, Edward said. I offered him a position in this company, financial security for his daughter, a new home. He paused. He said no. He said protecting someone in danger is what decent people do, and he didn't need a return on it. Another pause, deliberate. I've been in business for 32 years. I have hired several hundred people in that time. I have never met anyone who surprised me in quite the way Mason Ryder surprised me. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something real has entered them. Mason, Edward said, looking directly at him, what you showed my daughter, and me, wasn't bravery. Bravery is doing something you're afraid of. What you showed was something rarer than that. You showed character. And I wanted the people in this room who make decisions about this company's future and what it stands for to know that a man like that exists, and to know his name. Mason stood by the window with his water glass. There were 200 people in the room, and most of them were looking at him now, and he kept his expression still, which he'd learned how to do in circumstances considerably more alarming than this. He gave Edward a short nod. That was all. It was enough. Edward nodded back. The second announcement, Edward said, returning his attention to the room, is one I should have made sooner. Victoria Ashford has been running the operations of this company in all but title for the past 2 years. She has the mind for it, the integrity for it, and, I'll say this plainly, the judgment for it, which is the hardest thing to learn and the one that matters most. He looked at his daughter. Victoria, come up here. She crossed the room. Mason watched her, the way she moved, unhurried, composed, no performance in it. She stepped up beside her father and shook his hand and then, after a brief moment, let him pull her into a brief, genuine embrace, which she accepted without stiffening, which told Mason something about the two of them that pages of background wouldn't have. The room applauded. It was the kind of applause that meant something, not the polite applause of obligation, but the kind that had recognition in it. Victoria stood at the podium and spoke for 8 minutes. She thanked the board and the team and her father in that order. And then she said something that nobody in the room had been expecting, which was that the most important thing she'd learned in 11 days as a waitress was that the people who do the work that isn't seen are keeping everything standing, and that a company that didn't know that was building on a bad foundation. People wrote that down. Mason saw at least 4 people reach for their phones. Afterward, when the formal part had dissolved back into the ambient noise of a cocktail party, Whitmore arrived. This was not something Edward had anticipated, or if he had, he'd said nothing to indicate it. Whitmore appeared near the entrance in a dark suit and the expression of a man who'd decided that boldness was his best remaining option, which was what men in contracting situations sometimes decided before they understood how contracted the situation had actually become. He made it most of the way across the room before Edward's head of security. Greer, quiet and large and appearing from nowhere, positioned himself in a conversational way that was also not conversational at all. Mason saw it from across the room. He didn't move. Whitmore saw Victoria near the far windows and changed his direction, and Mason set down his water glass. He covered the distance without hurrying. He stepped into Whitmore's path in the same way he'd stepped into a dining room 3 weeks earlier. Not aggressively, not with performance, just with presence and the complete, simple fact of being there. Whitmore stopped. "I just want to speak to her," Whitmore said quietly, with the tightly controlled frustration of a man who knew he was in no position to be loud about anything. "I know," Mason said. "You have no—" "She doesn't want to talk to you," Mason said. "Tonight especially. You know that." Whitmore looked at him. He was a big man, and he was still, technically, a man with resources and leverage and a machine of lawyers and associates, though that machine had been shedding parts for the past 3 weeks, and the remaining parts were under strain. He looked at Mason the way he'd looked at him at the restaurant. The same calculation, the same effort at contempt. And he arrived at the same place. A man who wants nothing and can't be leveraged is a wall that money doesn't open. "You have no idea what you've done," Whitmore said, but his voice had lost whatever was needed to make it land. "You did it to yourself," Mason said. "That's the honest version." Whitmore held his ground for another 5 seconds, which was more about dignity than intention. Then he turned and went back toward the entrance, and Greer materialized again briefly to confirm the direction, and that was the end of it. Mason picked his water glass back up. Victoria appeared beside him 2 minutes later. "Was that—" "Yeah." "What did he say?" "Nothing worth repeating." She looked at the entrance where Whitmore had exited. Her jaw was slightly tight. "He's going to lose everything, you know. The inspectors are reopening 3 projects. There are former subcontractors who filed complaints they'd held back for years." She paused. "It didn't take anything dramatic. It just took someone finally paying attention." "Things fall apart eventually," Mason said. "Usually under their own weight." She looked at him sideways. "Is that your philosophy?" "More an observation." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the harbor through the tall windows. "My father did this partly to honor you," she said, "putting you in that speech, in front of all those people." "I know," Mason said. "He didn't need to." "I know he didn't." She paused. "Did it bother you?" He thought about it. "A little, but I think I understand why he did it." He looked at her. "He wanted the people who run your company to know what it looks like when somebody actually means it." She held his gaze for a moment. "What do you mean?" "Integrity," he said. "Most people in that room know the word. Your father wanted them to see the thing itself, so they'd recognize it." He looked back out at the water. "That's not nothing." She followed his gaze. They stood there for a moment side by side, with the harbor dark and silver behind the glass and the room warm and full of noise behind them. "I'm not good at this part," she said. "The mingling, the—" She gestured vaguely at the room. "I know," he said. "You've been working the room anyway." "How can you tell?" "You've spoken to 11 people in the last hour, different clusters. You didn't repeat yourself." He paused. "I've been watching." She turned and looked at him fully, which she did sometimes, this full, direct look that most people seem to find slightly unnerving. He didn't find it unnerving. He found it honest. "Why?" she asked. He thought about how to answer that without it being more than it was, or less than it was. He settled for, "Habit, and because you're interesting." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at the water. "I need to go back in," she said. 3 board members I haven't spoken to yet." "Go ahead." She started to turn, stopped. "Mason, thank you. For tonight, and the—" She stopped again, which was unusual for her. "Just thank you." "You already said that," he said. "I know," she said. "I meant it more again." And she walked back into the room, and he watched her go. And he stood by the window for a while with his water glass, looking out at the harbor. And something in him was quiet in a different way than usual. Not the quiet of an empty house, not the quiet of managed solitude, but something else. Something he didn't have an immediate word for yet. He set down the glass. He had to be home by 11. Lily's regular babysitter had an early morning. He found Edward briefly to say goodnight, and Edward shook his hand again, the same grip, the same brevity, but there was something warmer in it than there'd been in the workshop. "You've had enough of this for one night," Edward said, in a way that wasn't a question. "I've had about the right amount," Mason said. Edward actually smiled at that, which did something to his face that was considerably warmer than his usual expression. "Drive safe," he said. Mason collected his coat from the check room and walked out through the tall maritime doors into the cold night air. The harbor was dark out past the lights. A wind was coming off the water, clean and cold. He stood there for a moment before walking to his truck. In the room behind him, Victoria Ashford was talking to a board member about supply chain resilience with one part of her attention, and with another part she was thinking about a man who'd crossed a dining room for a stranger and then gone back to his dinner like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She was beginning to understand that ordinary was not the right word for it at all. The bookcase was finished on a Sunday. Mason had carried it upstairs in 2 sections, assembled it in the corner of Lily's room where she'd decided it belonged. Not where it made the most logistical sense, but where she'd always imagined it, which was beside the window so the light would fall on the spines. And when she came home from Mrs. Patterson's house, where she'd spent the afternoon, she stood in the doorway of her room and went very still. He watched her take it in, the way her eyes moved across it, shelf by shelf, top to bottom, the way she'd looked at the crayon diagram she'd drawn him and was now comparing it to the actual object in the actual room. Her mouth was slightly open. "It's exactly right," she said finally. "I used your measurements." "I know." She walked in and ran one hand along the top shelf. "You made the wood smooth." "You sand it and then you sand it again," he said, "and then you sand it one more time." She nodded like this was important information she was storing. Then she turned and hugged him around the middle, which she did sometimes without warning, and which he never got entirely used to, in the best possible way. He put his hand on the back of her head. "Thank you, Daddy," she said into his shirt. "You're welcome, Bug." She let go and started moving books from her floor stacks onto the shelves, with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been planning this for weeks, which she had. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a while before going downstairs to clean up the wood shavings he'd tracked through the hall. It was a Sunday in November, cold and clear, and the afternoon was quiet in the way he'd learned to hold on to, rather than resist. Dale Whitmore's situation continued to deteriorate through November in the incremental compounding way of things that have been structurally unsound for a long time and have finally encountered conditions that reveal it. The Planning Commission denied the renewal on 2 of his 3 pending contracts. The third was placed in an indefinite hold pending a compliance review, which in practical terms meant the same thing. 3 smaller subcontractors filed formal payment complaints with the State Contractor Licensing Board, complaints that had apparently been drafted months or years earlier and were now, with the change in atmosphere, being submitted. A 4th complaint came from a former project manager who'd left Whitmore's company in what his attorney called a mutual separation and what the project manager's attorney called something else entirely. The business publication that had run the first article ran a follow-up. A regional television station ran a segment. Neither of these things would have had the weight they carried without the other. The print piece gave the television segment sourcing, and the television segment gave the print piece reach. And together they produced the particular media dynamic that Whitmore's publicist described to him, with increasing exasperation, as a cycle. Whitmore fired his publicist. He hired another one. The new one told him the same thing the previous one had. By the first week of December, 2 of his major investors had requested meetings. These were not the kind of meetings where the investor arrives interested in opportunity. These were the kind where they arrive already knowing what they've decided and are present primarily for the formality. He lost both. The thing about Whitmore's empire was that it had been built on leverage in all of its forms. Financial leverage, social leverage, the leverage of being the kind of man who made people feel that crossing him was more costly than accommodating him. When that leverage began to erode, The erosion was rapid, because leverage was all it had ever been. There was no underlying goodwill, no reservoir of earned loyalty, no network of people who stayed because they genuinely believed in what the operation was doing. There were only people who'd calculated that association was worth its cost and who recalculated with impressive efficiency when the numbers changed. Mason read the follow-up article in Gerald's kitchen in Millbrook, where he was finishing a crown molding job that had turned into a window replacement and a section of water-damaged wall, because that was how renovation jobs went. Gerald made coffee and offered opinions about the development industry that were not uninformed, and Mason listened and drank his coffee and said, in the appropriate places. He did not feel satisfaction about Whitmore exactly. He felt something more like the recognition of a thing that had been a long time coming arriving on its own schedule, which was different from satisfaction and didn't require his participation. Victoria came to the workshop on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of December. She'd texted first, which she'd started doing rather than calling. He'd noticed the shift without commenting on it. Something about a text felt less like an intrusion, he supposed, when you were aware that someone's day was made up of jobs that required both hands. She texted, "Are you in the workshop this afternoon?" He texted back, "After 3. She arrived at 3:20. He was routing the edge of a cabinet door he was making for a client in Carver's Point, and he turned off the router when he heard the side door. She was in work clothes, the kind she wore on what she called field days, when she was visiting properties under development or meeting with contractors, not a boardroom. Dark pants, boots with actual tread on them, a charcoal jacket. She had a folder under her arm. "Working?" he asked. "I was in the area. I have a site visit at 4:30 in Millbrook." He turned back to the cabinet door and ran his hand along the edge to check it. "You could have just come in." The door was closed. It's always closed. Router's loud. He set the door down. "Just coffee's on the bench." She poured herself a cup from the thermos, or she'd learned where things were, in the incremental way of someone who visited a place enough times that its geography becomes familiar without her having planned it that way, and sat on the overturned bucket, which had also become, through repetition, her spot. The workshop had a particular quality in December. The space heater in the corner kept it functional but not warm, and the smell was wood and mineral spirits and the faint metallic edge of the space heater itself. Victoria had mentioned once that it smelled like her grandfather's garage, which she'd said as a neutral observation and then hadn't elaborated on, and he hadn't asked. "How's Lily?" she asked. "Good. She's reorganized her room twice since the bookcase went in." "Twice?" "She needed to optimize the system." He picked up a piece of sandpaper and started on the door face. "She's very serious about the system." Victoria smiled at that. She did it more easily than she had at first. The smile. In October, it had been something she managed, a professional deployment of warmth. By December, it arrived on its own, which was different. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. "Okay." "The Millbrook project, the one Whitmore lost the contract on. The city's going to rebid it in the spring, residential and mixed-use waterfront section." She opened the folder on her knee. "Ashford Group is going to put in a bid. I'd like it to be, but I want it done right. Not just built to code, actually done right. The subcontractors paid on time. The finish is real. The kind of project that in 30 years still looks like someone cared about it." He kept sanding. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to consult on the materials specs and the trade contractor selections. Not permanently, not a job, just the pre-construction phase." She paused. "I want someone on the spec side who can't be talked out of doing it right by someone on the finance side who wants to shave 4%. He looked up at her. "There are people with more experience at that scale. There are people with more experience who also have history with the developers who will be bidding against us, and who have other interests to protect." She held his gaze. "I want someone whose only interest is that it's done right." He was quiet for a moment. He put down the sandpaper and picked up the cabinet door and sighted down the edge. "It would take some evenings," he said. "I know. I'd need to be able to say no to something if I thought it was wrong. That's why I'm asking you." He set the door back down. "What does your father think?" "He thinks it's a good idea." A brief pause. "He also thinks everything I do is a good idea, which is useful but not always reliable as feedback. What does your operations director think? She looked at him. I haven't told him yet. Why not? Because I wanted to know if you'd say yes first. She said it plainly, without embarrassment, which he'd come to understand was how she operated. She was direct in the way of someone who'd learned that indirection wasted time and created problems. If you say no, the question doesn't come up. He looked at the cabinet door. He thought about the Millbrook waterfront, which he'd driven past for years and which had been declining in the piecemeal way of neglected things, and about what it could be if someone actually built it with intention. He thought about the evenings it would take, and about Lily's schedule, and about whether Mrs. Patterson would be willing to expand her sitting hours on a temporary basis. I'd need to see the site plan first, he said. Something shifted in Victoria's posture. Not relief exactly, more like a kind of quiet realignment, like a thing settling into the place it was supposed to be. I can have it to you by Friday, and I'd want to meet the project architect before I agreed to anything. Also reasonable. And I'm not coming to the office, he said. If we need to meet, it's here or on site. She looked at him for a moment. You really hate offices. I don't hate them. They're just not where the work is. She closed the folder. Here or on site, she said. Agreed. She finished her coffee and they talked for a while about the project in general terms. The scale of it, the timeline, the particular challenges of waterfront construction in a region with difficult soil conditions. And Mason listened more than he talked, which was his pattern, and asked questions that were specific enough that she found herself going back through her own notes to answer them, which she hadn't expected. At 4:10, she gathered her things to leave for the site visit. At the door, she paused. Lily's school has a winter program, she said. The thing at the end of term. Yeah, he said. The 15th. I know, I saw it on the... You mentioned it last week. She said the last part carefully, like she was aware of what it revealed about how attentively she'd been listening. I'd like to come, if that's okay. He looked at her. She held the look steadily, which was also her pattern, but there was something underneath it that was less managed than usual. You should know, he said, that Lily's class is doing a song about winter vegetables. Victoria blinked. About what? Winter vegetables. She's a parsnip. A beet. Then she laughed, real and sudden and genuine, and it did something to the quality of the cold afternoon air in the small workshop that Mason filed away without a label and thought about later. I would very much like to see that, she said. 3 o'clock on the 15th, he said. She nodded and went out into the cold. The winter program was at Lily's elementary school, in a gymnasium that had been decorated by the teachers and a PTA committee with the cheerful intensity of people who'd been given a reasonable budget and too much energy. Paper snowflakes. A banner that said Winter Wonderland in letters that were trying very hard. Folding chairs arranged in rows that were not quite straight. Mason arrived early because Lily needed to be there early, and he spent 20 minutes in the gymnasium watching it fill up with parents and grandparents and small children being administered last-minute costume adjustments. The parsnip costume was a long, cream-colored tube of fleece that Lily wore over her clothes, with a leafy green hat that she'd immediately begun to tilt at an angle. It's not supposed to be tilted, Mason said. I like it tilted, Lily said. You're a parsnip. Do parsnips tilt? She considered this with the gravity she brought to most questions. Mine does. He straightened the hat. She tilted it again as soon as his hand left it. He let it go. Victoria arrived at 2:50, which he'd half expected. She was precise about time in the way of people who understood that being late was a form of taking someone else's time without asking. She was in a coat he hadn't seen before, dove gray, and she'd brought a woman he didn't recognize, mid-40s, who turned out to be her executive assistant, Ellen, who was apparently the person who had reminded Victoria 3 times about the 15th and who attended things like this in the capacity of someone who ensured they actually happened. Ellen shook his hand with efficient friendliness and found seats 2 rows from the front, while Victoria stood beside Mason near the edge of the gymnasium and looked at the assembled children being herded into formation. Which one is she? Victoria asked. The parsnip with the tilted hat, Mason said. Victoria found Lily immediately. not hard, given the hat, and something passed across her face that was quieter than her usual expression, not sentimentality, not performance, just genuine attention. "She looks like you," she said, around the eyes. "She looks like her mother," he said. Victoria glanced at him. He kept his eyes on the gymnasium floor. She didn't push it, which was one of the things about her he'd come to appreciate. The program lasted 45 minutes and included a song about winter vegetables that was performed with tremendous conviction by 22 kindergartners who had, at most, 3 of the lyrics in common with each other at any given moment. Lily sang her part loudly and slightly off-tempo, and at one point caught her father's eye from the stage and gave him a wave that was more of a full-arm gesture, which Mason returned with a small raise of his hand. Beside him, Victoria laughed quietly at the wave. "She's not shy," she said. "No," he agreed. "She's really not." Afterward, in the gymnasium lobby, where parents collected children and compared notes on which vegetable had sung the best, Lily found Mason and then spotted Victoria and went still in the way children go still when they're reassessing a situation. "This is Victoria," Mason said. "She's a friend." Lily looked at Victoria with the frank appraisal of someone who hasn't yet learned that staring is rude, and Victoria met the look without deflecting. "I like your hat," Victoria said. "It's tilted on purpose," Lily said. "I can tell. It's better that way." Lily considered this, apparently decided it was the correct opinion, and moved on. "Do you work with my dad?" "A little bit," Victoria said. "He's helping me with something." "He's good at fixing things," Lily said, with the easy authority of someone reporting established fact. "I noticed that too," Victoria said. Lily seemed satisfied. She turned to Mason. "Can we get hot chocolate?" "There's some in the back." "The powdery kind," Lily said with mild displeasure. "Yes, the powdery kind." She weighed this. "Okay." She took his hand and then looked at Victoria. "Do you want powdery hot chocolate?" Victoria looked at Mason very briefly, the kind of glance that passes between 2 adults above a child's head, that is part amusement and part something more genuine than amusement. "Yes," she said, "very much." They had the powdery hot chocolate in paper cups at a folding table near the gymnasium door, the 3 of them, while the lobby noise of 100 families moved around them. Lily told Victoria about the vegetables program with the editorial confidence of someone who'd been in it and could therefore offer insider analysis. The song about carrots had gone better than the song about turnips, because Jake, who played the turnip, had forgotten to come in on time. The parsnip song was the best song. This was not bias. This was assessment. Victoria listened with total attentiveness and asked questions that were specific enough that Lily looked slightly surprised each time, the way children look when adults are paying more attention than they expected. Mason drank his powdery hot chocolate and watched them. He was aware of something happening that he didn't want to name too quickly, because naming things too quickly was a way of making them fragile. But he was aware of it. The following Saturday, he drove Lily out to Millbrook to walk the waterfront site with the project architect, a thorough woman named Adela, who had strong opinions about foundation depth and said so without apology, which Mason respected. Victoria met them there and brought site plans in a cardboard tube and unrolled them on the hood of Mason's truck because the site office wasn't set up yet. Lily, who had been promised she could bring her sketchbook, sat on a low concrete block near the water and drew what she described as the future, which turned out to be a drawing of 3 people standing in front of a building that might have been the Millbrook waterfront project, or might have been something else entirely. It was hard to say, but the 3 figures were clearly distinguishable by height, and she had labeled them, in her approximate spelling, Dad, Victra, Lily. She showed it to Mason at lunch, which they had at a diner 2 blocks from the site, because Adela knew the owner and swore by the fish chowder. He looked at the drawing for a moment. "That's a good drawing," he said. "I know," Lily said. She looked at it. "Is Victra coming to lunch?" "She's in the parking lot on a call." Lily nodded, the way she nodded about things she had already incorporated into her model of how things were. Then she put the drawing back in her sketchbook and picked up her grilled cheese. Victoria came in 5 minutes later, still in her coat, phone in her pocket, with the expression of someone who has finished a difficult call and is making the transition back to the present moment. She slid into the booth across from Lily and looked at the menu. "The chowder," Mason said. Adela was right. "Did she say that in a way that suggested there was no alternative?" Victoria asked, without looking up from the menu. "Pretty much." "Then I'll have the chowder." She set down the menu. "Lily, what are you having?" "Grilled cheese," Lily said. She'd already eaten one corner. "But I might have chowder, too." "You can have both," Mason said. Lily looked at him with the surprised pleasure of someone who'd been expecting resistance. "Really? You did a long morning." She went back to the grilled cheese with renewed purpose. Victoria looked at Mason across the table. It was a short look, nothing elaborate in it, but it was the kind of look that carries weight precisely because it isn't trying to, the kind that says this is good without saying anything. He held it for a moment, then looked out the diner window at the Millbrook waterfront, gray and quiet in December. Net. Christmas came without ceremony at Mason's house, which was the way he'd always handled it. A tree, some lights, Lily's stocking, a few presents he'd made or found at the second-hand place on Route 9, where he'd been shopping since before she was born. He'd gotten her a telescope from the second-hand place, one of the old refractor kind that cleaned up well, and he'd made her a small stand for it out of oak that he'd stained to match her bookcase, because she cared about things matching in ways he found both amusing and deeply familiar. He'd also, after some consideration, bought Victoria a book. It was a collection of photographs of early 20th century industrial construction, bridges, aqueducts, the massive public works projects of an era when people built things to last generations and apparently needed to document it. He'd found it at the same second-hand place, tucked between a stack of outdated car repair manuals, and he'd thought of her without deciding to. He left it on her doorstep on the 24th, because he was in the area making a delivery for a client, and because she was at her father's for the holiday, and he'd written her name on the paper bag he'd wrapped it in, and that was it. No card. She called him from her father's house at 9:30 that evening, after Lily was asleep. "The book?" she said. "Found it at a second-hand shop." A pause. "Where did you even... How did you know I'd want this?" "You mentioned once that you wanted to understand why things built before 1950 are still standing when things built after 1980 aren't." He paused. "First half of the book is probably relevant." "Mason." "It was a second-hand bookshop. It wasn't complicated." "You're doing the thing where you minimize Merry Christmas, Victoria." A brief silence. Then quieter, Merry Christmas. He could hear something in the background at her father's house. Voices, music, the ambient warmth of a full house. He was in his own quiet kitchen with a mug of tea going cold on the counter. "Is Lily asleep?" she asked. "Since 8. She wore herself out." "Is she happy?" He looked at the ceiling above the kitchen in the direction of Lily's room. "Yeah," he said. "She's happy." "Good." Another pause. "How are you? Honestly." He thought about it. "Honestly, I'm okay. It's a quiet night." Quiet good or quiet hard? He thought about that too. Both, maybe. It's okay. She didn't push it. She understood the shape of it, he thought. The way certain nights had a weight that wasn't bad exactly, just present. "My father asked about you," she said. "At dinner?" "What did he ask?" "He asked if you'd decided yet." Mason was quiet for a moment. "Decided what?" "That's what I said." A pause. He just smiled and went back to his plate, which is his way of saying he knows something I don't, which I find maddening. He might just be enjoying the ambiguity. "He absolutely is," she said. "He's insufferable about it." Mason smiled, which she couldn't see. "Tell him I'm working on it." "Working on what?" "Whatever he thinks I'm deciding." She was quiet for a beat. "That's going to make him smile again." "Good," Mason said. She laughed, and he heard her father's voice in the background saying something, and she said, "Give me a minute," to whoever it was, and then back to the phone. "I have to go. Extended family dinner." "Go ahead." "Mason," a pause, shorter than the others. "I'm glad you found the book." He picked up his mug. "I know," he said. "Good night, Victoria." She said good night, and the line went quiet. He sat in the kitchen for a while after. The house was very still. The tree was still lit up in the front room. He'd left the lights on because Lily liked to fall asleep knowing they were on, and the light came through the doorway in soft colors against the kitchen wall. He thought about Lily's drawing from the Millbrook diner. The three figures of unequal height labeled in approximate spelling. The way she'd shown it to him as a matter of fact rather than as a question, which was either a 5-year-old's limited awareness of what she was communicating or, and he suspected this more, a 5-year-old's uncomplicated sense of what was already true. He didn't know how to name what was happening between him and Victoria. He knew that it wasn't the same as what he'd had before. It couldn't be. Nothing could be. He'd made his peace with that. But he also knew that it wasn't less. It was different in quality. She was complicated and precise and impatient with herself in ways she was patient with other people, and she was learning, slowly, the particular skill of being somewhere without having an agenda. And she was good, he thought, in the specific way that mattered to him, which was not about polish or performance, but about what a person actually did when doing something cost them something. He got up and turned off the kitchen light. He checked the front door, checked the back, turned off the tree lights last because Lily wasn't awake to care anymore and the electricity bill was real. He went upstairs. Through the crack in Lily's door, in the dark, he could see the shape of her in the bed and the stuffed rabbit at her elbow and the bookcase along the wall, the shelves fully populated now, the wood pale in the darkness. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to bed and the house was still. And in that stillness there was, underneath everything, the particular quality of a man who has spent a long time keeping himself at the exact size of his life and is beginning, cautiously, to wonder whether that size was always the right one. January came in cold and without apology. The Millbrook waterfront project moved into its formal pre-construction phase in the second week of the new year, and Mason found himself spending 3 evenings a week at the kitchen table with site plans spread across the surface where Lily usually did her drawings, cross-referencing material specs against Adela's foundation notes, and leaving margin comments in his cramped, precise handwriting that Victoria told him looked like engineering notation, and he told her was just how he wrote. He was not comfortable calling it a second career. It was consulting work, finite, with a defined endpoint when the pre-construction phase wrapped in March. He kept the handyman jobs running. Gerald and Millbrook still had a second bathroom that needed attention, and there was a kitchen renovation starting in February on the east side of Carver's Point that he'd committed to before any of this started. He was not the kind of man who dropped one thing because another thing arrived. Lily adapted to the changed evenings with the flexibility of a child who had always known her father's work to be variable in its hours and consistent in everything else. She did her drawings at one end of the kitchen table while he worked at the other, and sometimes she asked what he was doing, and he explained in the simplified but not dishonest way he'd always explained his work to her, and she nodded and went back to her drawings. Victoria came to the house twice in January to go over plans. Both times she brought dinner, which the first time she announced as a practical matter. I was passing the place on Route 9, and it seemed efficient. And the second time she didn't explain at all, just set the bag on the counter and started unpacking it, which Mason understood was its own kind of explanation. The second time, Lily helped set the table. She did it with the focused attention she brought to tasks she'd decided mattered, setting the forks on the correct side, which Mason had taught her, and putting a glass of water at each place, and then standing back to assess the arrangement with the expression of someone checking their work against a standard. "That's good," Victoria said, looking at the table. "I know," Lily said, and went to get her own chair. Tikiam. The last of Dale Whitmore's major contracts was formally terminated in late January by mutual agreement, which was the legal way of saying one party had no remaining leverage to argue for anything else. The compliance review that had been hanging over the third municipal contract concluded with findings that his attorney described publicly as inconclusive, and that the Planning Commissioner's office described, in rather different language, in the formal report they issued on a Thursday afternoon. Mason read about it in the same regional publication that had run the first two pieces, on his phone during a lunch break at the kitchen renovation. He finished reading, put the phone in his pocket, and went back to the cabinet boxes he was hanging. There was nothing satisfying in it exactly. The word he'd have used, if pressed, was settled, the way a thing settles when the weight that was holding it out of balance is finally removed. Whitmore had been operating on the assumption that the cost of holding him accountable would always exceed the benefit, and he'd been right about that for long enough that he'd stopped examining the assumption. He'd been wrong eventually, the way people who stop examining their assumptions tend to be wrong eventually, and the wrongness had caught up with everything at once. Mason thought about what Victoria had said the night of the gala. It didn't take anything dramatic. It just took someone finally paying attention. That was it, he thought. That was most of it. He asked her something in February. They were at the Millbrook waterfront site, a Saturday morning, just the two of them. Adela had a conflict and the site supervisor wasn't due until afternoon. The ground was frozen and the harbor was gray and flat, and Victoria was reading a section of the foundation spec with her coat collar up and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked up. "You're going to anyway." "When you were at Harborview," he said, "working the floor, what were you actually looking for? Not the research version, the real version." She was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the spec page, then folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "I wanted to know what it felt like to not be Edward Ashford's daughter for 8 hours," she said. "To be someone who could be ignored or dismissed or just treated like a regular person without the name in front of me doing all the work." She paused. "I'd been running operations for the company for 2 years, and I still couldn't be sure, when someone listened to me, whether they were listening because my thinking was good or because of who my father is. And it felt exactly as hard as I'd known it would, and also different, because I'd always known, academically, what it costs people to be in service work. But knowing it and spending 8 hours on your feet being spoken to like your furniture are not the same thing." She looked at the harbor. "I was going to quit after 2 weeks anyway. I'd gotten what I needed, and then Whitmore grabbed your wrist," Mason said. "And then Whitmore grabbed my wrist," she said, "and nobody in that room moved. And I thought, these are people who know better. Some of those people definitely know better." And they calculated that intervening wasn't worth what it might cost them, and they made that calculation in about 4 seconds and went back to their food. She paused. "And then you stood up." He looked at the frozen ground. "I wasn't doing anything noble." "I know you weren't," she said. "That's the thing. You weren't performing it. You just did it because it was the thing to do." She turned to look at him directly. "Do you know how rare that is? Not people who know the right thing. People who just do it without calculating whether it's worth it." He didn't have an answer to that. He was aware, as he sometimes was in conversations with her, of being seen in a way he hadn't arranged for, and of not entirely knowing what to do with that. "You were calculating too," he said finally. "That night, what I was going to want for it." She didn't deny it. "Yes. And I didn't want anything. And you didn't want anything," she confirmed, which broke the calculation completely. She looked at him. "It took me a while to understand that you weren't hiding what you wanted. You genuinely didn't want anything, and that's a different kind of person." The harbor wind came off the water cold and steady. Mason pulled his jacket collar up. "I want things," he said. "I just don't want them from people who didn't offer them." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the harbor, and they stood there in the cold without saying anything, which had become, over months, its own kind of language between them. Edward called him in March, which Mason had half expected. Not because he'd been tracking it or because he thought Edward was maneuvering. He'd stopped being suspicious of Edward's motives somewhere around December, because the man had proven to be, fundamentally, someone who said what he meant and meant what he said, which was rarer than it should have been. He called because the pre-construction phase was wrapping, and because something was ending and something else was either beginning or not beginning, and Edward was a man who liked to understand which. "The Millbrook specs are done," Mason said when he answered. "Adela tells me they're the best she's worked from in 15 years, Edward said, which from Adela is approximately equivalent to anyone else saying they're perfect. "They're good," Mason said. There are two details in the foundation drainage I'd still want to revisit when the ground thaws, but the rest is solid. I'd like you to stay on, Edward said, through construction, not a formal position. I know you won't take a formal position. I won't take a formal position, Mason confirmed. A continuing consulting arrangement, your terms. Mason was in the workshop. He'd gone back to client work in full since the spec phase wound down, and he was finishing a set of built-in shelves for a family in Carver's Point who had 3 kids and not enough wall space. He set down the measuring tape. Why? He asked. Because good projects go wrong in construction when nobody's watching for the right things, and because you watch for the right things. There are people with more experience at this scale, yes, you've said. Edward's voice had a dry quality. You've also just produced pre-construction documentation that a firm with 40 employees couldn't have improved on, so perhaps we can retire that particular objection. Mason was quiet for a moment. My client work stays, he said. Of course. And if I see something wrong on that site, I say so to whoever needs to hear it, regardless of what it costs or what it holds up. That's why I want you there, Edward said, and I'll need a truck with better clearance than mine for the site access roads when the ground's soft. A brief pause. I'll have someone call you about that. I'll pick it out myself, Mason said. Of course you will, Edward said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. He told Victoria about the call that evening. She was at the kitchen table with Lily. This had become a thing that happened on Wednesday evenings. Victoria arriving around 5:30 with some plausible logistical reason and staying through dinner and the period of post-dinner activity that in Lily's schedule meant either drawing or a game that had rules Lily understood and explained at length and modified when they didn't suit her. They were doing a puzzle. It was a puzzle of the solar system that Lily had gotten for her birthday and that she approached with intense strategic focus, starting with the border and then organizing the remaining pieces by color region before beginning the interior. Victoria was following Lily's system with the attentiveness she brought to everything, not performing interest, actually interested, which Lily had registered without articulating in the way children register things. Mason set his coffee down and told Victoria what Edward had said. She kept her eyes on the puzzle. What did you tell him? That I'd do it. She placed a piece that turned out to be part of Jupiter. Good. You knew he was going to call. I suggested he might consider it. She glanced at him briefly. I didn't tell him to. I told him what I thought the project needed, and he drew his own conclusions. There's a difference, Mason said. Yes, she said, there is. And she went back to the puzzle. Lily looked up from her corner of the table. Are you talking about work? A little, Mason said. You talk about work a lot, Lily said, with mild complaint that was not directed at either of them specifically. We do, Victoria agreed. That's fair. Lily considered. It's okay. My dad always worked a lot. He works better when someone's around, though. She said this as a simple observational fact, the way she reported most things, and then went back to the puzzle. Victoria did not look at Mason. Mason picked up his coffee. The kitchen was warm and the puzzle was spread across the table, and outside the February wind was moving through the bare trees along the street, and the evening had the quality that good evenings have, which is not that nothing is complicated, but that the complications are resting for a little while. Lily asked about Victoria's mother in March. They were in the car, coming back from the grocery store, and Lily had been quiet in the contemplative way she got sometimes, which meant something was in progress. Does Victor have a mom? She asked. Yes, Mason said. Does she see her? I think they talk. They live in different places. Lily processed this. Like how Grandma lives far away, but we call her? Something like that. Another silence. Does Victor have a dad? Yes. You've heard me mention Edward. That's her dad. Is he nice? Mason thought about Edward in the workshop, looking at the tool wall. Edward at the gala, the brief real embrace. Edward on the phone, asking for things in the direct, unhurried way of a man who'd stopped being embarrassed about what he wanted. Yeah, he said. He's a good man. Lily nodded. Then, does she have kids? No? Another pause, longer. Does she want them? He glanced in the rearview mirror at her. She was looking out the window with the profile of someone asking a question they've been building toward. That's something you'd have to ask her, he said. Lily seemed to accept this. She looked out the window at the passing streets for a while. Then she said, I think she'd be good at it. Mason kept his eyes on the road. Why do you think that? Because she pays attention, Lily said simply, and went back to looking out the window. He drove the rest of the way home with that sitting in the cab with him, quiet and heavy in the way of true things. He told Victoria in April. Not the conversation. He wasn't going to tell a 30-year-old woman that a 6-year-old had evaluated her fitness for parenthood, even if the evaluation was accurate. But what it had clarified for him, he told her. In his own way, which was direct and also not entirely polished, because he was not a man who'd had much practice at this particular kind of conversation. They were at the waterfront site. Construction had started and the site had the productive disorder of early groundwork, equipment, marked ground, the early geometry of something that would eventually be a building. They'd walked the perimeter after his handoff meeting with the site supervisor, and now they were standing at the harbor edge where the water came up close to the construction boundary and the view opened out. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. I'm not good at this, he said. Saying it. I'm better at showing things than saying them, which I know isn't always enough. Mason, I'm getting there. She waited. She was good at waiting when it mattered. I wasn't looking for anything, he said. When I walked into that restaurant, I wasn't looking for anything when I walked across the room, and I wasn't looking for anything when I went back to my dinner. That's the honest truth. I was just a tired man trying to eat his pasta in peace. A corner of her mouth moved. But somewhere between that night and the tile job and the winter program and the puzzle and Wednesday evenings, he said, I started wanting things again, which I hadn't done in a while. He paused. And I need you to know that it's not because of who your father is or what you run or any of it. I figured that out pretty early, and I think you figured it out too. But I want to say it clearly. I know that, she said quietly. And I need you to know that I come with Lily, which I know you know, but I mean, she's not a side condition. She's the whole thing. I can't do this if it's not something she's part of. I know that too, Victoria said. And I'm a handyman who consults on construction projects, he said. I'm not going to become something else. I don't want to be something else. Mason, her voice was very quiet. I know all of this. I know you know, he said. I just needed to say it out loud, so it's clear. She looked at him for a moment, the full, direct look, the one that didn't leave much room for pretense. Then she said, Can I say something now? Yeah. I have spent 6 years being the person in the room who everyone's watching. Every meeting, every boardroom, every event. I'm Edward Ashford's daughter, and then I'm the CEO designate, and now I'm the CEO, and every interaction I have goes through that filter, whether I want it to or not. She paused. And the night you walked across a restaurant for me, you didn't know any of that. You just saw a person in trouble. You saw me. Not the name, not the position, just a person who needed someone to do something. She stopped. Do you know how long it's been since someone saw just me? He didn't answer because it wasn't a question that wanted an answer. I'm not easy, she said. I want you to know I know that. I work too much, and I get impatient when things aren't moving, and I've been told more than once that I argue when I should listen, which is probably fair. She paused. But I pay attention to what matters. And what matters to me... She stopped, recalibrated, and then said it plainly the way she said most important things. You matter to me. Lily matters to me. This, she gestured at the space between them, matters to me. He looked at the harbor. Then he looked at her. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay? Yeah, he said. Okay, let's do this. She stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed, sudden and unguarded, the surprised laugh that he'd come to think of as the realest thing about her, the one that arrived before she could decide about it. That's it? She said. That's your response? I said what I needed to say. You said what you needed to say. He looked at her. What else is there? She looked at him for another moment, still with the remnants of the laugh in her expression, and then she stepped close and put her hand on his jaw and kissed him, which was also not elaborate or performed. It was just real and brief, and when she stepped back, she was looking at him with the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they already knew. Okay, she said. Edward heard about it not from his daughter, but from Greer, who continued, professionally, to know things. He received the information on a Thursday morning with his coffee and his reading glasses and the feeling of something resolving that had been in motion for a long time. He did not call Victoria. He did not call Mason. He sat with it for a while in the study that was the only lived-in room in the house, in the chair he'd reupholstered 3 times, and he thought about the file he'd read 4 times in November. A man with an interesting gap between what he's capable of and what he's chosen to do with it. And he thought about the bookcase, and the workshop, and the way Mason had stood at the gala window watching Victoria work a room she didn't want to be working. He called his attorney the following week and began the process of formalizing the transition of the company's majority governance to Victoria. Not the first stage, that had happened at the gala, the full transition. The thing that meant it was hers entirely, with no remaining ambiguity about who held the weight. He told her at dinner, just the 2 of them, at the house. She sat with it for a long time. You don't have to do this yet, she said. I know, he said. I want to. I've wanted to for a while. I was waiting until I was certain you had what you needed. And now you're certain? He considered the question seriously, which was how he considered most things. I'm certain you have the competence and the judgment. I was certain of both 2 years ago. He paused. What I wasn't certain about was whether you had someone in your life who would tell you the truth when the truth was inconvenient. Someone who wasn't paid to have opinions about your decisions. He picked up his water glass. I'm more certain about that now. Victoria looked at her father across the table. She thought about a man who'd been willing to describe himself as nobody in a restaurant dining room, and who'd meant it. She thought about Wednesday evenings and the solar system puzzle and the site plans spread across a kitchen table, and a child who'd said he works better when someone's around with the uncomplicated accuracy of someone who simply reported what was true. He'd be irritated if he knew you were factoring him into this, she said. I know, Edward said. So we won't tell him. She looked at her father for a moment, at the 61-year-old face that had been weathered into something, the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the scotch he was nursing, and she felt the particular complicated love of a daughter, for a father who had not been perfect and had tried hard anyway, which was, she thought, the best you could ask of anyone. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Just run it well. I will, she said, and she meant it in the way she meant things, which was completely understood. In May, the Millbrook waterfront site had progressed enough that you could begin to see what it was going to be. The foundation was in, the framing was starting on the mixed-use section, and the residential building had reached the point where you could stand at the harbor edge and see the outline of floors emerging from the ground. Mason walked the site on a Saturday morning with Adela, who had the same strong opinions about the framing contractor's work that she'd had about the foundation specs, and who said so at length to the foreman, who had learned to listen to her. Mason walked behind them and checked the anchor bolt placement in the north section, which had been bothering him since Tuesday, and found that his concern had been correct and made a note for the site supervisor. Afterward, he sat on a low block at the harbor edge where Lily had sat in December with her sketchbook. He thought about December. He thought about the drawing, 3 figures of unequal height, the approximate spellings, the matter-of-fact quality of a child reporting what she saw. He thought about what it meant to build something that would last. Not just the building. Though the building was going to be good, he was making sure of that, but the larger thing, the harder thing, the thing you built not with your hands, but with your presence and your honesty and your willingness to keep showing up even when showing up was inconvenient. He'd spent 5 years keeping himself at the exact size of his life. He'd done it consciously, deliberately, not out of self-pity or resignation, but out of a genuine sense that this was what he had to offer, and that offering it fully was enough. A man who did the work right and showed up when he said he would, and slept fine at night. He'd meant that, He still meant it, but Lily had said he works better when someone's around, and she was 6, and she was right, and there was something in being right about by a 6-year-old that was hard to argue with. He was not the same as he'd been before. He knew that. What he'd had with his wife was its own thing, sealed in its time, and he'd made his peace with it in the slow, uneven way that peace actually gets made. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary days. He didn't need to be the same. He didn't need the new thing to be a replacement for the old thing. It could just be what it was. Victoria was not easy. She'd been right about that. She worked too much, and she was impatient, and she argued when she should listen. And she was also, underneath all of that, someone who paid attention to what mattered and who had chosen, with full knowledge of the alternatives, to be in this kitchen on Wednesday evenings doing a puzzle with a 6-year-old who called her Victra and had decided she'd be good at it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The thing about integrity, the real version, not the word people use in company mission statements, is that it isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive announced. It's the accumulation of small decisions made when nobody's watching, decisions to do the thing right even when doing it wrong would be easier, and nobody would know the difference. It's a man on his knees on a cold bathroom floor checking a level for the 4th time on a measurement that was already good. It's a woman sitting on an overturned bucket in a workshop, actually listening, not waiting for her turn. It's a father reading a bedtime story on a Tuesday when he's too tired to do it well and doing it anyway, because a child's experience of being loved doesn't wait for convenient moments. Mason Ryder had never described himself as a man of integrity. He would have found the phrase uncomfortable, the way people who actually have a thing find it uncomfortable to claim it. He was just a man who did what seemed right and didn't expect a return on it, and who had discovered, at 33, in a restaurant he'd stopped at for no particular reason, that doing what seemed right had consequences he hadn't planned for. Some of those consequences were a consulting arrangement that had turned into something closer to a calling. Some were a construction project that was going to stand for decades and would be good because someone had cared enough to insist on it at every stage. Some were a 6-year-old who tilted her parsnip hat at an angle and had opinions about shelf placement and had drawn 3 figures of unequal height on a diner napkin without fully understanding that she was drawing the future. And some were a woman who had stood in a warm restaurant on a rainy night watching an old Ford truck disappear into the dark, not knowing his name yet, already knowing that something had shifted. On a Saturday in May, Victoria drove to the waterfront site in the late morning and found Mason sitting at the harbor edge with his jacket collar up and his hands in his pockets, looking at the framing of the building rising behind him. She sat down beside him on the concrete block. They looked at the building for a while. The harbor was quiet, and the air smelled like salt water and fresh concrete and the particular mineral smell of turned earth. "The north section framing's 2 centimeters off on the 3rd anchor bay," he said. "I know. Adela called me. It'll get fixed." "I know it will. You'll make sure of it." He looked at the building. "It's going to be good," he said. "The building." "Yes," she said. "It is." A wind came off the water, steady and cold despite the season. She leaned slightly against his shoulder, which she'd started doing recently in the unannounced way of someone who'd stopped asking permission for small things. And he let it happen in the equally unannounced way of someone who'd stopped needing everything decided before it arrived. "Lily asked me yesterday if we were going to move," Victoria said. He looked at her. "Move where?" She didn't specify. She asked if we were going to get a bigger house. She said her bookcase would fit anywhere because it was well built. A pause. Her words. He looked back at the building. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know yet, but that her bookcase would definitely fit wherever we went." She paused. She said that was the main thing. He was quiet for a moment. "She's not wrong," he said. Victoria looked at him sideways. "No," she said. "She's not." The harbor moved. The framing of the building stood in the morning light, imperfect in the specific ways that things under construction are imperfect, and all of it correct. The water was ordinary and cold. The air smelled like the beginning of something. Mason Ryder had walked into a restaurant on a rainy night looking for nothing, and had found, in the slow and unplanned way that real things are found, everything that mattered. Not because he'd been brave. Bravery is doing something you're afraid of, and he hadn't been afraid. Because he'd simply been the person he was, in the place he happened to be, at the moment it turned out to matter. That was the whole story. That was, in the end, all any of it had ever been. And it was enough.